"Say your vows, Elizabeth, or so help me, you will sleep in the yard with the dogs." Her father's words were still lodged in her chest, like a splinter too deep to reach, as she walked toward the stranger at the front of Oak Haven's church. The dress had been her mother's once, let out at the seams with rough thread that pulled and puckered across her hips, a quiet cruelty stitched into the fabric itself. Before her, William Hale waited with his hat in both hands. He was not looking at the floor. He was not looking at the preacher. He was looking at her, directly, steadily, as though he had been waiting a long time. The pews held no well-wishers, only hunger, the particular kind people wear when someone else's ruin is the entertainment. When the iron ring settled onto her finger, it was warm, as though he had been holding it in his palm the whole time. She did not know what to do with that. What William Hale does next will shatter everything Elizabeth believes about herself and about him. Stay until the end. This story will change the way you see love. The wagon rolled out of Oak Haven before the church doors had fully closed behind them, and Elizabeth sat as far to the right of the bench as the wood would allow, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The town fell away in pieces, the feed store, the mill, the long white fence of the Calloway property. And then it was gone, and there was nothing but the open throat of Montana swallowing them whole. William did not speak. She had expected him to. Men who bought things liked to talk about what they'd bought. Her father had never stopped talking. About the land, about the stock, about what everything was worth and what everything cost, and how nothing ever measured up to what he deserved. She had spent 23 years listening to a man perform his own importance, and she had braced herself for another performance to begin the moment the wagon wheels found the open road. But William Hale held the reins loosely and watched the horizon the way a man watches weather, with patience and without complaint. The cold came in around midday. It did not announce itself. It simply arrived, the way Montana cold always did, seeping through the wool of her mother's dress, finding every poorly sewn seam. Elizabeth pressed her arms against her sides and told herself she was not shivering. She was nearly convincing. Without looking at her, William reached behind the bench and pulled a canvas coat from the bed of the wagon. He set it on the space between them. He did not offer it. He did not say, "You look cold," or "Here, take this." He simply placed it there and returned both hands to the reins, his eyes back on the road, as though the coat had always been meant to live in that particular spot. Elizabeth stared at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up and pulled it around her shoulders. It was heavy, and it smelled like wood smoke and saddle leather, and something else she could not name, something that was not unpleasant. He still did not speak. Another hour passed. The road climbed, and the pines thickened on either side, crowding the pale sky into a narrow strip above them. Elizabeth's throat had gone dry in the way that grief sometimes made it, not from crying, but from holding everything in so long that even the body forgot how to soften. William reached beneath the bench and brought up a canteen. He held it out toward her, his eyes still forward. She took it, drank, handed it back. "Thank you," she said. The words came out smaller than she intended. He nodded once. The road bent north. He followed it. She had expected cruelty. She knew cruelty, knew its rhythms, knew the way it liked to wait until you were tired before it showed its teeth. She had been cataloging William Hale since the moment her father shook his hand, searching for the version of this that made sense, the angle she had not yet seen. Men did not pay debts for nothing. Men did not marry women like her for nothing. There was always a price stitched into the lining of a kindness, Always a cost that came due the moment you stopped being useful. But he had given her his coat without looking at her. He had offered water without asking for gratitude. He had sat beside her for 3 hours in complete silence and made that silence feel somehow less like punishment than any room she had ever shared with her father. She pulled the canvas coat tighter around her shoulders. The mountains ahead were gray and enormous and indifferent to everything, to her history, to her shame, to the iron band on her finger. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel entirely small.
For the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel entirely small. That feeling lasted until Blackwood Ridge came into view, and then it became something else entirely, something she had no practiced name for. She had built the ranch in her mind during the long hours of riding. She was good at building things in her mind, mostly as preparation for disappointment. She had imagined a leaning structure, gray and wind-beaten, the kind of place a man builds when he has no one to build it for. A door that didn't hang true, a window stuffed with rags against the draft, a single room that smelled of old fire and older loneliness. She had told herself she could bear it. She had borne worse. What sat at the end of the ridge road was not that. The house was modest. She would not call it grand, and William clearly had no interest in grand, but it was solid. The logs were fitted close and chinked with care, the kind of work that took time and intention. A covered porch ran the length of the front, its boards even and unwarped. Smoke was already rising from the chimney, thin and steady, which meant he had arranged for someone to come ahead, or he had banked the fire himself before riding to Oakhaven that morning. Either way, someone had thought about her arrival before she had. A window box sat beneath the front window, empty now in the cold, but the soil in it had been recently turned. Elizabeth sat very still on the wagon bench and looked at all of it and did not speak.
William drew the horses to a stop and climbed down without ceremony. He came around to her side and offered his hand. She looked at it for a moment. That had become a habit already, this pause before accepting anything from him. And then she took it and stepped down onto the frozen ground of Blackwood Ridge. He led the horses toward the small barn to the left without asking her to follow or insisting she go inside. She stood in the yard and looked at the house. She went in alone. The door opened on a single room that served as kitchen and sitting area both, with a stone hearth that took up most of the far wall. The fire inside it was low but genuine, pushing warmth into every corner. A table sat near the window, square, 4 chairs, built from the same timber as the walls. A shelf above the hearth held a modest row of provisions: flour, salt, dried beans, a tin of coffee. And then she found the other room. A door to the left of the hearth opened into a small bedroom. The bed was framed in pine, fitted with a quilt that was not new, but had been recently washed. She could smell the lye soap and the cold air it had dried in. A braided rug covered the floor beside it. On the small table next to the bed sat a white ceramic pitcher and basin, and beside that, a single tallow candle in a tin holder. On the pillow, folded with the particular care of someone unused to folding delicate things, lay a pale blue ribbon.
Elizabeth stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a long time. It was not a room assembled in haste. It was not a room that said, "This will do." Every small thing in it had been placed by someone who had thought about the person who would stand exactly where she was standing. She heard William's boots on the porch. She stepped back into the main room before he entered, and when he came through the door, she was standing near the hearth with her hands out toward the fire. "It's a good house," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. William set his hat on the hook by the door. "It'll do better in spring." He said it like a promise.
Elizabeth held on to that, the word spring, spoken with such quiet certainty, as though he had already decided there would be one, as though her presence at Blackwood Ridge past the thaw was not a question worth debating. She filed it away in the place where she kept things she did not yet know how to trust.
She found the provisions before he had finished seeing to the horses. It was instinct more than intention. Her hands had always known what to do in a kitchen, had learned early that usefulness was the closest thing to safety a girl like her could manufacture. She found a pot, found the beans, found a heel of salt pork wrapped in cloth at the back of the shelf. By the time William came through the door, stamping frost from his boots, the fire was built up and the smell of something warm was already moving through the room. He stopped just inside the threshold and looked at the pot and then at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know how to cook," she said, which was not what he had meant, and she knew it. She set the table without asking where anything was kept, opening drawers until she found the spoons, lifting the shelf cloth until she found the bowls. She placed his at the head of the table, and hers near the hearth, slightly apart, the way she had always eaten at her father's house, close enough to serve, far enough to be invisible.
William sat down. He looked at the placement of the bowls for a moment. Then he stood back up, picked up his bowl, and moved it to the side of the table. He pulled out the chair at the head and looked at her. "Sit," he said. Elizabeth turned from the fire. "That's your chair. It's your table as much as mine. I'm fine where I am. I didn't ask if you were fine." He said it without hardness, the way a man states a fact about the weather. "I asked you to sit." She sat, because arguing required a kind of energy she had not yet rebuilt, and because something in the straightness of his posture told her this was not a point he would abandon. She pulled the chair in and set her hands in her lap, and felt the particular discomfort of a person occupying space they have been taught does not belong to them. He ladled the beans himself. He set her bowl before her first. They ate in silence. It was not the silence of her father's table, which had always been loaded with the threat of whatever mood lived behind his eyes that evening. This silence was different. It had no teeth. It simply existed between them like the table itself, solid and without agenda. She ate more than she intended to. The cold ride had hollowed her out, and the food was hot and the fire was close, and some animal part of her had decided, without consulting the rest, that it was safe enough to be hungry. She caught herself reaching for a second helping and stopped. "Eat," William said, without looking up from his bowl. "I've had enough." He said nothing. He ladled more into her bowl anyway, and returned to his own meal as though the matter were settled, as though feeding her were simply a task on a list he had already committed to completing. Elizabeth looked at the bowl. She looked at the man across the table, the one who had not yet raised his voice, had not yet made her feel the specific shame of taking up too much space in a room. She picked up her spoon. Outside, the Montana wind found the eaves and moved along them, looking for weakness. Inside, the fire held. She did not feel entirely like a burden. She was beginning to find that more unsettling than if she had. Sleep did not come easily. It rarely had. Her body had spent too many years on alert, one ear always tuned to the sounds of a house that could turn hostile without warning. But the bed at Blackwood Ridge was firm and the quilt was heavy, and the fire in the main room had burned down to a steady pulse of heat that pushed warmth under the bedroom door in slow, even waves. She lay on her back and listened to the silence, and told herself it was only a matter of time before something broke. In the morning, William was already gone from the house when she rose. She could hear him at the barn, the low, rhythmic sound of a man working with purpose, unhurried and self-contained. She built the fire back up and put the coffee on and stood in the kitchen in the gray morning light, trying to determine what her place was in the architecture of this life he had built. She began to learn the house the way she had always learned difficult things, quietly and by herself. She opened the cabinet beside the hearth and found extra candles, a tin of matches, a folded piece of oilcloth. She found the root cellar door beneath the braided rug in the corner and lifted it and looked down into the cool dark, where potatoes and dried apples waited in patient rows. She opened the drawer in the small table beside the bedroom window, looking for nothing in particular, a spare button perhaps, or a length of twine. She found the bird. It sat in the back corner of the drawer, small enough to rest in her palm,
carved from a piece of pale birchwood worn smooth by years of handling. A sparrow, wings slightly lifted, head tilted at that particular angle sparrows held when they were deciding whether to stay or go. The detail was extraordinary for something so small. Each feather suggested rather than stated, the beak no wider than a pine needle, the eyes 2 tiny indentations that somehow managed to look alive. Elizabeth picked it up. Her hand was not steady. She had owned this bird. She had owned it at 10 years old, carried it in her coat pocket through an entire winter, taken it out to hold on the bad days when her father's voice was at its worst. She had lost it on the road outside of town one afternoon and had gone back 3 times to look for it in the frozen mud, and had cried only once, alone, where no one could add it to the list of things that proved she was too much and not enough simultaneously. She had never told anyone about the bird. It was not the kind of thing you told people when you were the kind of girl she had been, the kind of girl people were already watching for weakness. She stood in the small bedroom of a ranch house in Montana with a carved sparrow in her palm and felt the floor of everything she thought she understood shift beneath her feet. William Hale had her bird. William Hale had kept her bird. She heard his boots on the porch and closed her fingers around it and stood very still, her heart doing something loud and disorganized in her chest. He came through the door and moved to the basin to wash his hands, and she walked out of the bedroom and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the back of him, at the set of his shoulders, at the way he moved through his own space like a man who had long ago made peace with silence. She looked at him the way you look at a door when you have just discovered it leads somewhere you did not expect. She did not ask, not yet, but the question was alive in her now, and it had the sparrow's wings, slightly lifted, tilted, deciding whether to stay. She lasted 2 more days. 2 days of watching him from the corners of rooms, of studying the way he moved through the ranch with the particular economy of a man who had never had anything to waste. 2 days of cooking and cleaning and carrying water from the well while the carved bird sat in her apron pocket, small and inexplicable and maddening. 2 days of telling herself there was a reasonable explanation, that he had found it on the road, that it meant nothing, that she was building a cathedral out of a coincidence because she was desperate and lonely and had never been shown kindness without a price attached. On the 3rd evening, she set his supper on the table and stood across from him and put the bird between them. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. "Where did you get that?" she said. It was not a question. Her voice had gone somewhere flat and airless, the voice she used when she had already decided to survive whatever came next. William looked at the bird for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "You know where," he said.
Something cracked open in her chest. She had expected denial, had almost needed it, because denial she knew how to navigate. What she did not know how to navigate was the quiet certainty in his voice, the absence of shame or performance, as though he had simply been waiting for her to find it and was relieved the waiting was done. "You pity me," she said. Her voice broke on the last word, and she hated it from that. "That's what this is. The coat, the chair at the head of the table, the room you built like someone was going to—" She stopped, pressed her hands flat against the table. "I have been pitied my entire life, William, and I will not live inside someone's charity and call it a marriage. I won't do it." He did not raise his voice. He did not move back from the table. "Sit down, Elizabeth." "I don't want to sit, please." The word was quiet, and it cost him something. She could hear that it did. She sat. He was still for a long moment, his hands around his coffee cup, his eyes on the middle distance of a memory she could not see. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Not softer, exactly, but younger somehow, stripped of the lacquered quiet he wore like a second coat.
"There was a boy," he said. "Winter of 1861. Dirt poor and too proud to show it, which is a particular kind of cold. He used to cut through the alley behind your father's property on his way to the mill, where he swept floors for pennies. He paused. One morning he hadn't eaten in 2 days. He didn't tell anyone. Boys like that didn't tell anyone. Elizabeth had gone very still. A girl came out the back door. William continued. Heavy coat. Brown hair coming loose from its braid. She had a piece of bread wrapped in a cloth, and she held it out to him. And she didn't say poor thing, and she didn't look away from his face while she did it. His jaw moved. She just handed it to him. Like he was a person. Like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. The fire spoke quietly in the hearth. She dropped something when she went back inside. He said, I kept it. Elizabeth looked at the bird on the table between them. Then she looked at him. Really looked. Past the weathered face and the careful silence. All the way back to a winter morning and a hungry boy in an alley who had been seen. Her eyes filled. She did not look away.
She wanted to. Every instinct she had been raised with, every reflex built from years of being too visible in the wrong ways and invisible in the ways that mattered, told her to drop her eyes, to fold herself back into the careful smallness she wore like armor. But she did not look away, and neither did he. And something passed between them in that long moment that had no name yet, but was beginning to need one. The blizzard arrived that night without apology. She woke to a sound she had never heard, the wind not howling but pressing, a solid and constant weight against the walls of the house, as though the Montana winter had decided to test the quality of William's workmanship all at once. She lay still for a moment listening, and then she rose and opened the bedroom door and found him already at the window, a candle in his hand, looking out at a world that had turned entirely white. "Stay inside," he said, without turning around. "I need to get to the animals." "You can't go out in that." "The mare is close to foaling." He was already pulling on his coat. "She won't make it through the night alone."
She wanted to argue. She looked at the wall of white beyond the glass and understood argument was a luxury the storm had not left room for. She built the fire up instead, stacking the logs with the focused efficiency of someone who needed her hands to be doing something useful, while the rest of her stood at the window and watched the darkness for the shape of him. He was gone a long time. When the door finally opened and he came through it, he brought half the storm with him, snow in the folds of his coat, ice in his beard, his hands shaking with the particular violence of cold that has gone past discomfort into something more serious. Elizabeth had the blanket off the chair before he had finished closing the door. She pushed it around his shoulders and steered him toward the hearth, and did not ask permission to do either. He sat heavily and held his hands toward the fire. "The mare?" she asked. "Settled. Not tonight, after all." A pause. "Maybe tomorrow." She heated water and brought it in the basin and set it on the floor before him without comment. He looked at it, and then at her, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but the particular look of a man unaccustomed to being tended to, encountering it again and not yet knowing where to put it.
They stayed close to the fire, because the cold had driven the warmth to a narrow radius around the hearth. There was no negotiating the geometry of it. The storm had made the decision for them. She sat on the floor with her back against the stone base, and he sat in the chair above her, and they watched the fire and listened to the wind dismantle the world outside, and neither of them pretended the closeness was anything other than what it was. He told her about the ranch, how he had chosen the ridge for the windbreak, how the soil ran deep on the south-facing slope, how he had spent 3 winters building before he'd moved a single piece of furniture inside. She listened and asked questions, and he answered them fully, without the careful rationing of words she had grown used to from him. She told him, without planning to, about her mother's garden, the roses her mother had grown along the fence before the fever took her, how she had tried to keep them after, and how her father had pulled them out the following spring without explanation. William was quiet for a moment. "I turned the window box last month," he said. She looked up at him. "Figured you might want to plant something, come spring." The storm pressed against the walls of the house and found them solid. Inside, the fire held its ground, and two people who had both spent a long time being alone sat together in its light and began, without ceremony or declaration, to feel like something more than strangers. The blizzard did not break until the second morning. It retreated the way Montana storms always did, not with apology, but with indifference, leaving behind a silence so complete it had texture, and a world remade entirely in white. The ridge glittered. The pine boughs bent low under their burden. The sky above it all was the particular blue that only exists after a great violence has passed, and the air has been scoured clean of everything impure. Elizabeth stood on the porch with her coffee and looked at it, and felt for the first time in her memory that she was standing in a place that was hers to stand in. William came up beside her. They stood together the way they had learned to stand, close enough that the cold was more bearable, far enough that nothing was assumed. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him sidelong. His jaw was set in that particular way it got when he was organizing words he had been carrying for a long time, sorting them into an order that would bear the weight of what they had to say. "The debt," he said. "Your father's debt." She waited. "There was no debt. Not before I made one." The coffee cup was warm in her hands. She held it tighter.
"I went to your father," William said, his voice steady and without decoration. "I came to him with the offer. Told him I would cover what he owed the bank, plus enough beyond it that he could settle his other accounts and have money left to drink himself through the winter." He paused. He didn't ask a single question about where I'd take you or how you'd be kept. He asked if I'd go higher. William's jaw worked. I went higher. The ridge was very quiet around them. "I had been watching your father's house go to ruin for 2 years," he continued. "I had been watching you carry it, watching you take what he gave you and ask for nothing, and shrink yourself down to a size he found acceptable, and still never be small enough to escape his contempt." His voice did not rise. It went lower, the way deep water goes when the current picks up. "I knew what that house was doing to you. I had watched it long enough." Elizabeth set her coffee cup on the porch rail with great care, as though sudden movement might break something irreplaceable. "You had no right," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "I didn't. You should have asked me. You would have said no." She opened her mouth and closed it again, because they both knew it was true. She would have said no. She would have said no and meant it, and gone back inside that house, and continued to disappear one season at a time until there was nothing left to disappear. "I am not a thing to be rescued, William. I know that." He turned to look at her fully, and his eyes held something she had been too guarded to read clearly until now. Not pity, never pity, but a devotion so old and so quietly maintained that it had become structural, load-bearing, built into him the way the logs of his house were built into each other. "I didn't come to your father's house because I thought you were helpless. I came because I had watched you survive that place for years, and I knew you deserved something better, and I was the only one who was going to do anything about it." The cold moved between them, and neither of them stepped back from it. "You built this house," she said slowly. "The window box, the room, the ribbon, the quilt washed in cold air and lye soap. You built all of it, for me." "Yes." One word. Carrying 15 years. Elizabeth looked out at the white ridge, at the sky scoured clean, at the light falling without prejudice over everything it touched. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like a burden someone was enduring. She felt like a reason.
She was still learning what to do with that, still turning it over in her hands like something fragile and foreign, when the sound of a horse on the ridge road brought her to the window 3 days later. She knew the way he sat a horse before she could make out his face, the particular slump of a man who had never once in his life considered that his posture communicated anything about his character. Cyrus Thorne rode the way he did everything, as though the world owed him a smoother road and was failing to deliver. Elizabeth set down the mending in her lap and did not move. William was at the barn. She heard the horse stop in the yard, heard her father's boots hit the frozen ground with the heavy deliberateness of a man arriving to collect something. The knock on the door was not a knock, it was an announcement. She opened it before he could knock again. Cyrus Thorne looked older than she remembered, which surprised her. It had only been weeks, but Blackwood Ridge had apparently done something to her perception of time, stretched it out and filled it with enough living that the distance felt longer. He looked at her the way he always had, with that particular inventory gaze, checking her the way a man checks a ledger for errors. "You look fed," he said. It was not a compliment. "What do you want, Papa?" He stepped forward as though to come inside, and she did not move from the doorway. Something crossed his face, surprise, recalibration. She watched him locate his angle. "I want what's fair," he said. "Hale paid less than the land is worth, less than you're worth as it happens, now that the Delacroix boy has shown some interest." "There is no negotiation," Elizabeth said. Her voice was even. She had not known it would be until it was. "You don't speak for the arrangement, girl. Hale does. Go fetch him." "I speak for this house." Cyrus Thorne's face darkened in the way she had spent her childhood learning to read as a warning. She read it now the same way she always had, and for the first time did not reorganize herself around it. "You were a burden under my roof for 23 years, he said, low and deliberate, the voice he used when he wanted the words to leave marks. "Don't mistake one man's peculiar charity for an identity." The yard was very quiet. "She said there's no negotiation." William's voice came from behind her, not loud, not heated, carrying the particular authority of a man who has already decided how this ends and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. He came to stand beside her in the doorway, not in front of her, and that distinction was not lost on Elizabeth. Cyrus looked at him with the evaluating squint of a man reassessing his leverage. Whatever he found in William's expression did not encourage him. "I have a legal—" "You have nothing. The agreement was settled in full, witnessed, and signed. You rode 2 days in winter cold to stand in my yard and frighten a woman who doesn't frighten anymore." A pause. "Turn your horse around, Cyrus." The silence stretched across the yard like ice across a creek, thin in the middle, dangerous to test. Cyrus Thorne looked at his daughter one last time. She met his eyes and held them, and did not apologize for the space she occupied, did not make herself smaller, did not look away. She stood on the threshold of a home built for her by a man who had kept a sparrow for 15 years, and she let her father see exactly who she had become. He turned his horse around. Elizabeth watched him go until the ridge road bent and took him from sight. Then she exhaled, slow and complete, like a woman setting down a weight she had carried so long she had stopped noticing its shape. William's hand found hers at her side. She did not pull away. Spring came to Blackwood Ridge the way grace comes to people who have survived a long winter. Not announced, not dramatic, but undeniable. One morning, the light through the bedroom window was different, softer and longer, and the air that pushed under the door had lost its teeth. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slope first, the way William had said it would, and beneath it the ground was dark and willing and alive with everything that had been waiting underneath. Elizabeth planted roses in the window box. She had ordered the cuttings through the postal rider in February, had written the letter in careful script at the kitchen table while William read by the fire, had folded it and sealed it before she fully understood what the act meant, that she was making a decision about next spring and the spring after that, that she was planting something with the quiet assumption she would be here to see it bloom. William had watched her seal the envelope and said nothing, but she had seen the corner of his mouth move. It was he who found her in the south field on the morning the first cuttings took root. She was on her knees in the dark soil with her hands working carefully around the base of a stem, and when she sat back on her heels and looked up at the sky, it was so extravagantly blue, and the air smelled so precisely of thawed earth and pine resin and possibility that something moved through her chest like a current.
She heard him come and did not turn around. He crouched beside her in the field and looked at what she had planted, and she looked at the side of his face and thought about the boy in the alley and the bread and the sparrow, about the room built before she arrived and the quilt washed in cold air, about a hand in a doorway and the long ride home through a Montana she had been afraid of and had learned instead to love. "I want to marry you," she said. He turned to look at her. "Again," she said, differently. He was quiet for a moment, that particular quiet of his that she had learned was not absence, but attention, the silence of a man giving something its full weight. Then he reached into the pocket of his work coat and held out his open palm. The iron band from Oakhaven sat there. Beside it, a second ring, thin and plain, cut from the same pale birch wood as the sparrow, sanded smooth and fitted with the careful imprecision of a man who worked better with timber than jewelry. She looked at it for a long time. "I made it in January," he said, "during the blizzard, while you were sleeping." She took the wooden ring and held it between her fingers, this small carved thing made in secret during a storm by a man who had loved her longer than she had known herself capable of being loved. "No preacher," she said, "no preacher, no congregation watching for the fall. Just the field," he said, "just us." She slid the wooden ring onto her finger. He took the iron band from his own palm and held it out, and she understood. This was not him claiming her. This was him asking. She took it and placed it on his hand herself, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they stayed like that, kneeling together in the dark soil of Blackwood Ridge, with the spring sky enormous above them, and the roses newly planted, and the whole long future of the place stretching out in every direction like a field that had been given rain. No vows were spoken. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, in bread given without pity, in a sparrow kept for 15 years, in a chair at the head of a table, and a coat laid down without a word. They had been marrying each other, she understood now, since the very beginning. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder and closed her eyes and felt the sun on her face and the earth under her knees and the wooden ring on her finger, and she was not too much and she was not too little, and she was home.